technology is changing every day. This change is also affecting warfare. Many war machines are now being built using artificial intelligence and advanced technological inventions. Special military aircrafts, drones, tanks, and missile systems. But despite these advances, armies can suffer huge losses. Very interesting things have been happening in the Russian army in recent days. Bombs dropped from airplanes used by Russian soldiers have fallen on the Russian city of Belgorod. There is an extraordinary crisis in Russia. The Russian people are experiencing a major security crisis. Tension in the country has risen very high. What is the background of these events? How did warplanes with advanced technologies bomb Russian cities? What is happening in Russia as a daily news team? We did a quick investigation into all aspects of this event. The information our team uncovered will surprise you. Thanks to independent journalism, hidden aspects of the war are being revealed. You can contribute to the development of independent journalism by supporting our team who worked hard to prepare this news. You can use the super thanks button below the video. Let's start if you're ready. Everything is changing in the war between Russia and Ukraine. None of the Russian army's war plans have worked. That's why the Russian army is trying to develop new war strategies. But the Ukrainian army continues to show a historic resistance against Russia. It is now common knowledge that the Russian army's ground forces cannot win a victory in Ukraine, having lost a large number of tanks. The Russian army now wants to launch air operations. However, the first attempt of these operations caused a major crisis. It is known that one of the most effective aircraft of the Russian aerospace forces is the Su34 special military aircraft. The Russian government claimed that it was the most powerful military aircraft in the world. However, this operation has revealed how irrational Russia's claims are. A Russian Su-34, a twin-engine fighter bomber, was assigned to bomb the Ukrainian army, but the bombs dropped from the plane fell on the city of Belgorod, 24 miles north of Ukraine. There was a huge panic in the city. There have been explosions in the Russian city of Belgorod since the beginning of the war. Extraordinary developments are taking place in the areas used by the Russian army in this city. An incident in January was one of the most important consequences of the problems in the city, especially sergeants serving in the unit. In the Korechchinsky district of the city of Belgorod threw a grenade to establish authority and caused the death of 3 Russian soldiers. In addition, 16 people were injured in this incident. This mistake of the Russian sergeant soon became known in the city. Moreover, since the beginning of the war, missile shells have often fallen on the city. Thousands of Russian citizens living in Belgorod started to leave the city. The bombs dropped from the Su-34 aircraft caused the crisis in the city to grow even more. Thousands of Russians tried to flee the city immediately after the bombing. After everyone set off, traffic was blocked and chaos ensued in the city. Meanwhile, the Russian people began to feel a great fear after the incident became public knowledge. The Russian government made a statement. According to a statement from the Kremlin, the Su-34 planes had to urgently release the munitions they were carrying. The Russian fighter pilots released these bombs so that they would not fall on the city and kill hundreds of people. But for the Russian people, this explanation was not acceptable. First, it was never acceptable that the Su-34 planes had difficulty carrying bombs. The people of Belgorod are wondering why these planes dropped bombs. A young man in Belgorod told the Russian press, "If this is an accident, those who caused the accident should resign." After this approach of the people of Belgorod, the reaction against Putin's government in Russia increased even more. However, some news in the Russian press claimed that the incident was not an accident. After these claims, the Russian people experienced a great shock. It is known that soldiers in the Russian army are subjected to racism and mobbing. Moreover, most of the soldiers serving in the Russian army do not want to invade Ukraine. This leads Russian soldiers to take extraordinary decisions. Since the beginning of the war, there have been many incidents of Russian soldiers damaging ammunition on many fronts. Many Russian soldiers are forced to fight. In addition, Russian commanders treat the soldiers very badly. Especially soldiers from Russia's minority peoples are constantly subjected to racism in the army. These soldiers hate their commanders. Allegations that Russian Air Force pilots deliberately dropped these bombs on the city of Belgorod are now the talk of the town in Russia. Following these allegations, the Russian Air Force has decided to suspend their operations. Anton Gerashchenko, advisor to the Ukrainian Interior Minister, tweeted about the issue. Gerashchenko said it seems the Russians have started a counter-offensive against themselves. This incident in the Russian army has turned into a major security crisis. It is said that these operations have been stopped in case Russian pilots attack the Kremlin. Putin is afraid that Russian soldiers will start a big revolt against. It is claimed that the majority of Russia's soldiers hate Putin. However, Russian commanders are very strict on this issue and prevent anti-Putin Russian soldiers from organizing. It is thought that if Russian soldiers start to act together against Putin, Putin will not be able to do anything. Recently, tensions between Putin and Russian commanders have increased. Russian commanders may act together with rebel soldiers and stage a military coup against them. Russian commanders may act together with rebel soldiers and stage a military coup against Putin. Russian media reports say that there is no concrete evidence of a coup at the moment. However, the opinions of experts who research on Russia on this issue are very clear. According to experts, if the Russian army suffers more losses in Ukraine, Russian commanders may stage a coup against Putin. Russian security problems are increasing, raising the possibility of a military coup. After the bombs dropped in Belgorod, the Russian people are outraged against Putin and the danger in Belgorod remains. There was another very interesting development in the city today. Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov announced that another bomb has been found in the city. It was announced that one of the bombs dropped from the plane has not exploded yet. Houses around the bomb site were immediately evacuated. According to the governor, 3,000 people have been removed from the area. It was decided that this bomb would be destroyed in a controlled manner by explosive technicians and bomb disposal experts. The evacuated Russian citizens experienced a great panic in Russia. Such incidents are doing Putin a lot of damage. These problems in the Russian army are affecting the course of the war. Ukrainian army is also carrying out very successful operations and inflicting a heavier defeat on the Russian army. Russian leader Vladimir Putin was preparing for an attack that could break through the Ukrainian defense positions in the spring season. However, Ukrainian forces destroyed most of the equipment the Russians needed to launch such a large-scale offensive. In addition to their attacks on Russian forces in many directions, Ukrainian forces made a move towards the Crimea. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has signaled many times that Crimea, which the Kremlin illegally annexed in 2014, will be liberated by Ukrainian forces simultaneously with the attacks on Russian positions in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces carried out offensives against the military assets of the Russian army in Crimea. These attacks disrupted all of Putin's plans and forced him to devise a new strategy. The consequences of the recapture of Crimea by the Ukrainian armed forces mean great destruction for Moscow. So what steps is the Kiev administration taking for Crimea? Let's all interpret Ukraine's Crimean operation in detail. At a time when Russian forces thought the Ukrainians were focused on the Eastern Front, Ukrainian forces launched unexpected attacks. These attacks by the Ukrainians can be interpreted as the beginning of their effort to retake Crimea. What makes this a possible scenario is the points that the Ukrainian forces have been targeting in Crimea. As you can see on the map, there are two major highways between Kherson and Crimea, with the Ukrainian leader Zelensky targeting Crimea. The Russian army increased its measures at the crossing points between Ukraine and Crimea. Ukrainian forces attempted to attack two Russian targets in northern Crimea. An explosion occurred in the area where the Russian military unit was located near the city of Armyansk in the north of Crimea. It was shared on social communication platforms in a short time when the explosion occurred in Armyansk. With the spread of rumors that the Ukrainian forces will begin their attack on Crimea, Russian forces have deployed many important equipment, including air defense systems in Crimea. In this attack by the Ukrainians, the people who heard the explosions stated that these sounds had nothing to do with the air defense systems. The fact that these systems deployed by the Russians in Crimea were not active in this attack indicates that the measures taken by the Russian forces were insufficient. In another Ukrainian attack on Crimea, Zongki was targeted. Tanks located in Crimea was subjected to a massive attack using UAVs. 12 unmanned aerial vehicles simultaneously participated in the attack. This Ukrainian attack was neutralized by Russian forces, partly by air defense systems and partly by electronic warfare systems. However, the debris of drones damaged many structures in the area. Besides, the Ukrainian forces scared the Russians badly with this attack. A large number of UAVs launched in Ukraine did not encounter any problems until they reached Sanchi. According to sources close to Russia, this attack by Ukrainian forces was carried out from the territory of the Nikolaev region. UAVs, which have successfully covered a distance of approximately 90 miles, have demonstrated that Ukrainian forces have the potential to strike deep into the Crimea. These attacks by the Ukrainian forces terrified the Russian soldiers in the Crimea. This recent Ukrainian attack on the Kherson and Crimean link roads can be described as the footstep of the Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces are making many moves that will be beneficial to take the Crimea. Ukrainian forces think that in order to liberate Crimea, all ties with Russia must be severed. Ukrainian forces, in coordination with an anti-war group of Russian citizens, struck a bomb-laden vehicle, causing heavy damage to the Kerch-Bosphorus bridge. Following the escalation of attacks by Ukrainian forces on Crimea, there has been a large increase in the number of Russian citizens wishing to leave the peninsula. So Russian citizens who want to leave Crimea flock to the ferry line in the Kerch Strait. However, due to the density in the region, the ferry lines move slowly. The Russian army uses the M14 and Il-105 en route in southern Ukraine to move faster on these highways. There are regions under Russian control such as Mariupol and Melitopol. Sankawi is one of the residential areas on this route, and it is a transit point during Russian military shipments. Ukrainian forces want to block the Russian military's military shipments to Crimea. Ukrainian forces launched offensives in the direction of Melitopol to block support from the Russian mainland to Crimea. Successive attacks were carried out by the Ukrainian forces on the points where the Russian forces were concentrated in Melitopol and Mariupol. Russian forces have designated a shopping center in Mariupol as a military base. After Ukrainian forces found that the mall was being used by Russian soldiers, a large-scale attack on the area began simultaneously with this attack. Ukrainian forces struck an oil depot very close to the city of Melitopol, which was used as a military base by Russian forces. Both these attacks inflicted heavy losses on the Russian forces. In addition, the Ukrainian forces took an important step towards the liberation of Crimea. In the past year, we have witnessed very heavy clashes between Ukrainian and Russian forces. After these clashes, Ukrainian and Russian troops turned the war into a stagnant phase to further examine what they had learned on the battlefield. Ukraine's attacks to liberate Crimea indicate that the war has started a new season. We clearly understand from the events that took place in the past few days that the Russian forces could not develop an important tactic against the Ukrainian attacks. The Russian army, which cannot make the right moves strategically, will continue to be crushed by the attacks of the Ukrainian forces. When we look at the Ukrainian forces, we see that the Ukrainians studied their lessons well during the stagnant war. Unlike the Russian forces, the Ukrainians shaped the army for the tactical offensive of the Russian army. At the same time, the Ukrainian forces shaped their attack strategy according to the Russian defense strategy and switched to an attack model in which the Russian forces would suffer more severe damage compared to the Ukrainian forces. The biggest handicap of the Russians is that they are constantly consuming but not able to make any gains. At the same time, the Kremlin government is experiencing a huge lack of support. The Kiev government enjoys great support from its Western allies. Even if the Western countries do not meet all the equipment required by the Kiev government, they do not hesitate to deliver any equipment they think the Ukrainian army needs. Ukraine's Western allies agree that Crimea is Ukrainian territory. For this reason, they will meet the equipment requested by the Ukrainian forces for the recapture of Crimea. It will be easier than expected for the Ukrainians to retake Crimea, changing the offensive strategy. Ukrainian troops will receive the support they expect from their Western allies and will be able to launch simpler but more effective attacks on Crimea. At the same time, more modern and effective equipment is included in the military aid packages that Western countries have recently made to Ukraine. Sending better quality and useful equipment to Ukraine by Western countries will facilitate the work of Ukrainian forces in Crimea. There are a lot of updates from the Donetsk region here. Russian forces concentrated their efforts on seizing the ground to the north of Avdiivka. Ukrainian forces had repelled major attacks on Vasyl and Novobakhmutka and stabilized the front line. But Russian forces recently received substantial reinforcements and in a new wave of attack, managed to breach the Ukrainian defense. Last time I told you that after Ukrainians managed to push Russians from Wesela back to the highway, Russians decided to switch their focus to Novobakhmutka in order to improve their tactical position relative to Ukrainian positions in Krasnohorivka. I also told you that there are attempts to conduct a mechanized assault and engulf Novobakhmutka failed because Ukrainians leveraged the heights around Alexis and Ropol to secure their flanks. The freshest reports indicate that Russians decided to switch to frontal assaults on Krasnohorivka once again. After the previous engagements in this region, Russian forces maintained a foothold on the western side of the highway in a resumed offensive. Fierce fights broke out near the lakes around Wesela. Their plan was the same: attack Vasyl in front while simultaneously moving towards the hills to hit Wesela from the back. This time, Russian forces succeeded and took control over the cellar by establishing control over these hills. Russians immediately made the eastern part of Krasnohorivka untenable. The difference in elevation here is almost 40 meters. So Ukrainians completely mined the area and moved to the central part of the village, which is located on another hill. Ukrainians have also responded to the deteriorating situation by reinforcing the Krasnohorivka group with several detachments. At first glance, it is surprising how Russian units managed to breach Ukrainian defense here after a series of defeats and sustained high losses, especially in armor. However, as it turned out, Russians have recently deployed a lot of fresh troops to the Avdiivka direction, including newly mobilized soldiers. Fresh reinforcements allowed Russian units to utilize more manpower and not be as constrained by losses as previously. Russian sources reported that their advancement inside Krasnohorivka was constrained due to mines. It looks like Ukrainians understood that once Russians secured the hills, Ukrainians would no longer have an absolute tactical advantage and prepared the outskirts of the village in advance for the Russian entrance. Ukrainian sources reported that Russians started making attempts at expanding control around Krasnohorivka, especially to the north of it. They also reported that Russians engaged their aviation much more frequently and also started conducting mechanized assaults. Geolocated footage provided by the Ukrainian 110th Mechanized Brigade shows heavy engagements of tanks and armored vehicles. It also shows how Russian infantry tried to maintain their positions in the tree lines despite constant drone and artillery fire. Unfortunately, Ukrainian positions north of Avdiivka are much less fortified than those to the south of Avdiivka, which is why Russians managed to expand their bridgehead and slowly push Ukrainians out of Krasnohorivka. The loss of Krasnohorivka is a significant development because it opens Russia's access to one of Avdiivka's supply lines. A frontal assault on Avdiivka from Krasnohorivka is not an option, so the next logical step for Russians will be an attempt to take Novokalinivka and other settlements to the north of Avdiivka. That is why Ukrainians are reportedly creating firing positions for big-caliber machine guns around Krasnohorivka. Ukrainians have also sent additional supplies and reinforcements, expecting Russian forces to try to capitalize on their recent gains and keep up the momentum of advancement. Overall, Russian forces are likely trying to exploit the excessive Ukrainian focus on Bakhmut and their preparation for a counter-offensive around Bakhmut. The best way to undermine their counter-offensive efforts would be to create problems somewhere else and force them to use their accumulated manpower to solve these problems at the expense of their main goal. Recent developments to the north of Avdiivka do not look good, although talks about the encirclement are still premature. The main supply hub of Avdiivka remains Horlivka, which is why Russians are unlikely to force Ukrainians to leave Avdiivka without achieving significant progress in the most fortified direction of this region.